So I made a little video the other day about why alcohol makes us fat. So a quick little overview of that, and then I'll go into some other things that aren't so great when we drink alcohol. So first of all, when we are drinking alcohol, we are going to end up with this byproduct called acetaldehyde. Now, where this can make you fat is kind of two main things. So essentially, we're making a lot of NADH. This is basically an anabolic state. When we have a lot of NADH, we've converted NAD plus to NADH. Now, NADH is something that can then go into the electron transport chain. Essentially, the more NADH that we've produced in an anabolic state, the more we're going to send into the electron transport chain, the more input we have, and the more ATP we end up making. And this applies to any of the substrates that we're bringing in, so carbs, protein, fat, whatever it is. But essentially, the more input you have into the electron transport chain, the sooner your body's going to go, I've got enough energy, I've got enough ATP, I don't need any more. And what we do with the excess is we convert it into fat, because we can't really store any ATP. So the body will just convert any excess ATP into fat. On that note as well, something else that's interesting is, as I said, when we convert alcohol into acetaldehyde, we can then convert it into something a little less dangerous for the body, which is called acetate. And now acetate can then be converted into acetyl-CoA. And much like the input into the electron transport chain via NADH, the acetyl-CoA, of course, is also going to be fed eventually down into the electron transport chain as well. And of course, any excess that we're bringing in that our body doesn't need and says, we've got enough energy here, we've got enough, we don't need to bring any more in, any excess is going to get converted into fat. So that's how alcohol makes you fat. So what about some of the other negative things? So another one is that when we are producing a lot of NADH, we inevitably end up making a lot of something called reactive oxygen species. I'm not going to go too much into what they are, but essentially it's molecules that have too many electrons, and they can then bind onto other things in the body, like, for example, important things like our DNA, and that can basically make them dysfunctional. So of course it makes sense that if we have a lot of reactive oxygen species and they're able to bind onto our DNA and make it not work properly, make it not be able to be replicated properly, then of course we're going to have some major issues in our body. Now, we're always creating a lot of reactive oxygen species anyway, just, in daily life, throughout the day, we're going to be making ROS. But our body has very good mechanisms to be able to break them down and turn them into things that aren't harmful, like water. But of course, anytime that the body is having to deal with a whole lot of these reactive oxygen species, its capacity eventually is going to run out. And the problem with alcohol is that it creates a huge amount of reactive oxygen species, which are hard for our body to be able to deal with, on top of all the other things in our body that are creating reactive oxygen species. So it basically just maxes out our capacity to be able to break them down. So another thing that can happen with the metabolism of alcohol to acetaldehyde is that we can end up producing these things called protein adducts. And they're essentially molecules that can bind onto our proteins in our body and kind of make them sticky, not work properly. And if you imagine that proteins in our body are not just structural tissues, like, for example, our muscle tissue, proteins also make up our enzymes and our receptors and things like that. And these sort of proteins require a certain shape in order to be able to function properly. So, for example, if we imagine a receptor is a certain shape, and that allows it to receive certain molecules to bind onto it and then create an effect downstream. But if you imagine if that receptor has a protein adduct attached to it, and then the shape of that receptor changes, the substances that want to bind to that receptor aren't going to be able to bind properly. And then, of course, that receptor is not going to function properly. So these protein adducts can be really disastrous to our proteins. Another thing that they tend to be able to do as well is that they can stimulate our leukocytes, which are our white blood cells. essentially anything in the body where it is not functioning properly, or it's in an area that it shouldn't be, whatever it is, the body will react as if it's a foreign substance, like a pathogen, and it will bring the white blood cells to the area to try and destroy it and remove it. The problem with this, though, is that it's going to stimulate the inflammatory process. And so if you imagine that there's a lot of these protein adducts starting to build up, for example, in the liver where we're metabolizing this alcohol, then of course we're going to bring a lot of inflammation to the area. So I hope that makes sense as to why you also become quite inflamed, and the liver becomes very inflamed with alcohol consumption.